So good evening, everybody. For those of you who are new here, my name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest educator with the Department of Entomology on Purdue University's campus. I also happen to work a very great deal with a lot of invasive species that occur in our woodlands. So often I will address issues regarding insects or other invertebrate pests that occur within our hardwood areas. However, oftentimes I do want to address plants too, because these have impacts on our hardwoods. And I know a lot of you will have questions because unfortunately, a lot of these plants interface very easily between those urban or near urban forest areas and the properties we want to protect. I have a decent amount of experience working with multiflora rose. There are a lot of woodlots I've walked through where I've had to step carefully around it. I have flown drones to try to find it. And I happen to love growing roses myself, though I'm not very good at it. So I have kind of an interest in this plant as just being me. Why don't we go ahead and dive in a little bit? There's a lot of history I like to cover when I talk about multiflora rose. Now, to address the biggest question we usually have, where does this come from? So this is a native to Asian areas, Japan, Korea, China, etc. But we intentionally introduced it. This one wasn't an accidental introduction that someone brought over when they were shipping something. We actually brought it over here intentionally. We introduced it as a Rolls cultivar because it had these showy white and pink blooms. See, I had that information in there already and I just forgot it. Um, and in fact, we still use it today for rose cultivation. And you will find some information I'll talk about a little later that state laws will vary based on that. We also, various departments like highway departments, DNR, et cetera, in the distant past would plant this to try to provide wildlife cover and erosion control along roadways. And unfortunately, that's one of those actions we definitely regret because it's since spread and it's become a major nuisance plant. So as for where you find it, I kind of mentioned this a moment ago. Multiflora rose has a lot of areas it can cover. So it is maintained by certain licensed nurseries, again, depending on where your state is, for use as grafting stock. A lot of the roses that you love are actually grafted out of a combination of Rosa multiflora and Rosa chinensis. In fact, polyantha roses are multiflora rose and Rosa chinensis grafted together. Uh, Oftentimes, people will intentionally plant this or intentionally cultivate where they find it to use them as rose supplements. Now, I can't speak to the scientific benefit of roses as health products. I'm not even going to try that, but that's definitely not legal in some places. You cannot develop multiflora rose without licensing here in the state of Indiana as well. So please don't do it and don't give yourself a massive headache in the future. You can usually find multiflora rose beginning to take over understory areas where there's like a nice wood lot that has some canopy opening in it, or you can find it along the edges of wooded areas or roadsides. And the reason for this being is that this plant, the thing that makes it invasive, makes it very capable of taking over those edge habitat areas that oftentimes a lot of plants or animals don't like to be around. So multiflora rose will tend to favor areas with well-drained soils, but they're also very good at taking over infertile soils. So they're able to survive a lot of environments that other plants aren't really going to be successful in, which is common with a lot of our invasive plant species. Oftentimes, the invasive plant species that we struggle with are those plants that have a developmental strategy where they will spread as much of their seed over as wide of an area as they can. They're going to make sure those seeds are very, very durable. And those seeds will then sprout up in areas where a lot of things just can't survive very well. And what'll happen is there are just so many seeds that attrition rate will take out a significant portion of their population, but it won't be nearly enough, and they will be able to survive. In ecology, we refer to that as an R-type strategy for those of you who are interested in that. They are very aggressive plants. So these plants, they are able to spread not only through their seeds, which can last a significant amount of time in the soil, but they can also spread through a process called layering, where at the very tips of the canes themselves, if they come into contact with the soil, will begin to form new roots and thus begin to form a new clone off the plant. Now, when it comes to regulation, this is what we've learned about this over time. This is what's resulted from it. Unfortunately, Indiana does allow for the development of multiflora rose. However, there's a big caveat to that. Indiana only allows it in nurseries for the purposes of grafting stock. It does not allow it in any other way, and those nurseries are required to be licensed and monitored by the Department of Natural Resources. However, you're going to find that those laws will vary by state quite a bit. For example, Illinois has it on its list of noxious weeds, making it prohibited to develop altogether, whereas Washington state has no regulation for multiflora rose, none at all. And the best that a lot of their extension services can do is just try to educate people on how to get rid of it if they find it and they don't want it. One of the things that we do here in Indiana is if you're found intentionally growing multiflora rose without the proper licensing, it's a $500 fine. Me personally, I think that's not steep enough, but I'm just here to educate folks. I don't make the laws. So one of the things, I mentioned this a moment ago, and one of the things I like to share a lot because I just kind of love roses in general, multiflora rose is what is used to create most of the modern roses you know today. Not all of them, they have different sources. I don't know all of those sources. There's a lot of rose knowledge I have yet to learn myself. But if you combine multiflora rose and Rosa chinensis, that means that you have now created a polyantha rose. And polyantha roses are the parental stock of a lot of the roses we love, I believe, including knockout roses, several hybrids, all kinds of different things. Many of the ornamental varieties today come from rose stock that could be created as far back as the original introduction in the 1800s. So this plant is kind of an interesting double-edged sword. We've used it a lot. We will probably continue to use it a lot, hopefully under very controlled conditions, but obviously it's become a problem. So what I want to do now, for those of you who may need to brush up on how to identify them, or maybe a little bit of information to better understand what they look like and how they develop, I'm going to go over just identifying the different parts of the plant so you can understand what you're looking for here. Now, for those of you who grow roses, you're probably very familiar with rose hips. These are the actual fruit of a rose. And the rose hips of multiflora rose bears a lot of resemblance to that of most other rose species. You're going to find that as a true rose, they're going to develop their hips that'll have this funny little balloon shape. They're going to be kind of a reddish color that may change a little orangey depending on how their development is going. Those fruit are going to contain the seeds. The seeds, here's what becomes nightmarish when you talk about multiflora rose. The seeds can persist in the soil for up to 20 years, possibly more. They follow the same life pattern as other roses, meaning they need to be cold stratified. So the environment here in Indiana makes a really great one for developing at least rose seeds, if not roses themselves. And the other problem is that multiflora rose, a single plant within its a single season, can produce a lot of seeds. We're talking thousands of seeds, depending on the size of the plant. Remember, when you run into a briar of multiflora rose in the woods that could cover half an acre, that can oftentimes be a single organism that has all those blooms that are producing all those seeds. And that makes the removal a gigantic, monumental task, because you're not only fighting the plant itself, you're continuously fighting its seed bank. And that is the work of years. So the other part, that this is the one that we're going to run into the most, obviously, is going to be the canes. The way the canes look is very particular. Now, when we talk about roses that we grow on our properties, we often talk about cane management with them because we want to make sure we shape the plants in certain ways to encourage their growth, because oftentimes roses grown that are intentionally grown can choke themselves very easily. You'll have canes that aren't developing well, and you can encourage disease or other issues with them. However, multiflora rose canes just keep going. They will grow over themselves into a gigantic tangle that is extremely difficult to work with. The canes can get as long as 13 feet. I think I've actually seen canes that are longer than that myself. And when the tips are green and able to grow, this is what we call the meristematic tip. This is the growth point on the plant. When they come into contact with the soil, those tips will develop roots, creating a new bud union, basically. So that way, new canes will now come out of that spot and just make that plant a gigantic mess. It develops very easily clonally, basically, and it will spread like wildfire if you don't pay attention to it. There was a property that I went to in Park County a few months ago where the gentleman, I'm sorry, I actually don't know that, where the people who own the property had developed this beautiful set of acreage with woods on them. And some of the people I was working with were asking questions, asking, did I see any invasive species? So I just took a glance around, and sure enough, there was multiflora rose growing on a hillside that was just beginning to spread all throughout the understory in this beautiful woodlot that this person had. And it was very, very unfortunate because you could see them doing layering and continuing to develop. And hopefully that person has gotten the help they need to be able to resolve that. But unfortunately, it's a big task. So the canes themselves are fairly easy to identify. This is probably the easiest part because they're going to create this gigantic tangled mess that will block any kind of passage. It will block the movement of most kinds of animals because they're thick enough to block even smaller mammals sometimes if they get bad enough. And I think this picture kind of tells that story really, really well. Now, I kind of got ahead of myself here, but one thing I do want to point out as well, the thorns on multiflora rose are incredibly sharp and incredibly grabby. So there was once I was teaching a class for a watershed leadership class that I was assisting with. We were in a state park, and unfortunately they had multiflora rose infestations. And as the class was walking by them, I kept warning people to watch out because the thorns on multiflora rose, they can really grab you, and you will not enjoy that experience. They're very sharp, very large thorns for a rose of that size. All right, so now the blooms. So for those of you who weren't present earlier, and for those of you watching on YouTube, someone posed the question to me earlier, uh, can invasive rose species have red or pink blooms? And several people who regularly work with multiflora rose are also part of this call said, yes, they have found pink roses on multiflora rose. So you'll have to be aware that when you see the blooms on them, they can be pink, they can be white. I have normally seen white myself. I've not yet run into pink ones, but they are out there. They do exist. So the blooms are going to occur May through June. But keep in mind, this plant will survive a significant portion of time and remain active well before then. It will produce these blooms that are very showy. The blooms are actually very fragrant too. If this wasn't such a nasty invasive, this is actually a very lovely little plant. This is why we use it as stock for a lot of our roses that we develop now. It's actually a really, really good rose. It's just incredibly difficult to control, and it's very invasive. The blooms themselves aren't very large. They're only going to be 1 to 2 inches in diameter, so you're not looking at something that's giant. But they will be very showy, and they will definitely be very noticeable when you're walking around your woodlot or wherever you're moving around. Nothing else really blooms like this in the woods. So the leaves, if you're familiar with roses, are going to be very, very similar to leaves that you have seen before. Their leaves are going to come out very early. Oftentimes in a woodlot, they are going to be the first thing you see go green. So there's oftentimes, if you work with like a local SISMA, anybody who's working with invasive plants, one of the general rules that people like this operate by is that the first things to go green are going to be your invasive plants 9 times out of 10. And this is very true for multiflora rose. They will leaf out very early, they will stay green, and they will stay green far past when other plants are starting to go into their dormancy. Now the leaves are pinnates and they have a toothed edge. So what you're seeing here, I'm going to go back to that previous image momentarily. You are not looking at a bunch of leaves on a branch. You are looking at several leaflets. That is the whole leaf right there. This is what that means. The leaves are going to have that same serrated edge that most roses do, and they're going to kind of look a little bit shiny, a little bit waxy. And on multiflora rose, the leaves are typically about 1 to 2 inches in length. So as far as roses go, this would be something that I would expect to see out of anything that's along the same size as like a knockout rose. It's going to be bigger though than a lot of your hybrids or climbing or drifting roses that you may have planted. So a little bit on some of my own experience with multiflora rose. I want to show off some of the information that I've been able to collect that I've been doing for the last several years now as I work with different state parks trying to help them map out their invasive species. So the image you're looking at here was taken from a drone that is about 200 feet off ground level. I was piloting this drone right around late March, I believe, and this was actually during the pandemic. And what had happened here was the state park wanted to take advantage of some of the time where there weren't people present and try to map out where their big invasive species infestations were. Now, this is occurring in McCormick's Creek State Park. And what you're seeing here, this image in front of you was taken right by Wolf Cave. I am just south of Wolf Cave Nature Preserve. Now, I can't fly my drone over the nature preserve. That's not legal. So I was staying in a very tight area. So there wasn't a whole bunch of space that I could look at, but the space that I had was very, very informative. So if you'll note here in this picture, you may see a lot of these trees have yet to green out. However, you can see that the understory is very, very green. And anything that you see in that understory that's green, that's multiflora rose, unfortunately. So McCormick's Creek State Park, like a lot of our state parks, are constantly battling invasive species. They have done incredible things in removing them. The amount of work they put behind removing Asian bush honeysuckle is just incredible to me. Their staff works incredibly hard to get rid of them. Unfortunately, those invasive plants have been choking out the native development that they try to encourage. Thus, they're reasons why they want to get rid of them and just to maintain the park's natural beauty. This is when I was an extension educator working in Clay and Owen counties, so they asked for my help being a drone pilot to help them map it out. And here I'm just kind of highlighting a little bit of that multiflora rose so you could get the idea of what I'm talking about when I say the understory of these plants. Thankfully, the camera on the drone that I was flying is very good for the purposes of kind of looking past things and getting very, very clear images. So I took advantage of that. And I actually have a whole video that I would normally show off. Sometimes it doesn't work very well on Zoom, unfortunately. But this kind of gives you the idea where the park had created several, or at least encouraged several areas in the canopy to be open because naturally that encourages the development of a wooded area. That's a part of natural succession and allows lots of understory plants to develop and new trees to begin to replace the old. Unfortunately, that also creates a situation where an invasive species can develop right in there and get a foothold. And this is what we're looking at here with multiflora rose. Now, like I mentioned before, the trees haven't yet leafed out. This is one of those strategies that invasives like multiflora rose is going to use. The trees aren't leafing out, meaning they can get a huge amount of energy built up very quickly because they're not fighting for sunlight with anything else. They're greening out earlier, they're hardy to the cooler temperatures, so they are taking full advantage of that to be able to develop a lot of energy very early on, thus their ability to spread widely. Now, some of the things, and I haven't created a slide for this yet, I will. One of the things I want to do is I want to go back to that area and see how it is doing. Some of you may recall that there were a couple tornadoes that struck the area in McCormick's Creek Park last year in 2023. And I believe they were right in this area that I'm showing you right now. So I want to return there and actually hopefully get permission to do another drone flight to see how that area is developing and how it's recovered since. So control options, probably a lot of you are here to hear this tonight. Control options haven't changed a very great deal in the last few years. That still remains very similar. Unfortunately, it is a big task. And one thing that I want to get across is that the removal and management of multiflora rose is going to be the work of years. If you get started on it and you're starting to use your chemicals, if you're starting to remove the plant, you're going to be doing this for a while. So you just need to be braced for quite a bit of time put into it. Now, as an individual plant and on a landscape, multiflora rose is very difficult to control. I've already mentioned a little bit of why that is. Its ability to layer and develop out of the tips of its own canes as a clone essentially makes it able to spread very, very widely and very quickly, because that can happen just simply in a season. The plant also has the nasty tendency to regrow from roots. So if you just take off the top of the plant, it's definitely not dead. You still have a root system there and it will develop out of it. The other problem also that I mentioned earlier is that its seed bank will last. It will last and last for decades. And in single multiflora rose plants, some of the reading I was doing just recently getting ready for tonight was saying that a single plant can develop thousands upon thousands of seeds in a given season, depending on the size and health of the plant. The other challenge is a severe infestation could just be really challenging to navigate because these plants are dense. They're thick, they don't allow for walking, and you've got to come up with some kind of effective plan to be able to start chopping away at this because you're looking at a literal briar hedge that could be several feet in depth. So there are some good things here. Smaller plants can be removed by hand. Just be careful of the thorns. The key is to remove the entire root system. So don't just assume that if you find a very small cane of multiflora rose, you can just pull it. You also need to dig it out too. Make sure you get the entirety of that root system. However, one thing that I do want to stress quite a bit here is don't attempt to remove a heavy infestation without some kind of equipment. And I would definitely not try to do that without help. A lot of the reason here is some of that equipment you need a spotter for just to be safe. Unfortunately, if you default to like using a chainsaw to try to get rid of some of your invasive plants, multiflora rose is not an easy one to use chainsaws with because of its density. It will be challenging to try to get a chainsaw in there in a position where it's going to be effective as you begin to dig into the briar, depending on how thick it is. One of the recommendations for it, now this is best when the plants are young and small, is to go ahead and mow them down 3 to 6 times throughout a season, because that way you are causing that plant to become stressed. You are forcing it to use its energy to regrow. And that means that when you do use a chemical treatment on it, it's going to be more effective. If you're looking at larger plants, you're essentially looking at excavation, the use of heavier equipment like a backhoe, a tractor with a chain, etc. And you've got to get all the roots out of it. Now, I have seen people who don't necessarily use those to go after the heavier infestations because there are going to be a lot of places where you simply can't get equipment like that to it. And in that case, I mean, unfortunately, you're just looking at a lot of backbreaking labor. So I would strongly suggest you do not attempt to tackle this by yourself. I also want to emphasize that there are SISMAs in your counties, groups that are entirely dedicated to the removal of invasive plants. Get familiar with them. They are the folks who can provide you the help you need, or at least education on the types of things you can do to help you get rid of these infestations. Now, as for biological control, there really isn't any kind of product that's available for multiflora rose that you could use to try to get rid of it. However, we do have some native biocontrol that may assist you. And I see a question pop up in chat regarding that last slide. So someone is asking, forest preserves have been implementing bobcats to take out invasives in DuPage and King counties in Illinois. Would that work for this? Yes, that is. The biggest problem that I run into isn't so much the willingness to do it, it's more the logistics of it, because some areas it may simply not be possible to get something like a bobcat in. So you're going to have to look at the infestation you're working with and figure out if that's going to work for you or not. Now, as for the biological controls that we have here in the Midwest or other places throughout the country, there are a few of them. Rosette disease is one that I'm familiar with. I've seen it hit roses before, and it creates what people often refer to as the witch's broom effect. It'll cause this unusual reddening of leaves and tips. It'll make the growth of the plants become very spindly and unusual. There's also a mite that will spread it from rose to rose. Now, when I say this, one of the important things is, here, I'm going to show you a picture of it so you have an idea of what this looks like. Rosette disease will cause the growth to go all kinds of funky. You can see here that this rose that has these lovely pink blooms on it has become kind of twisted and spindly. It looks very unusual. This is very telltale evidence of the presence of it. You'll also see canes will often they'll have a shape similar to switchgrass sometimes, thus the moniker witch's broom. However, one thing I want you to all to keep in mind is I don't want you to encourage rose rosette disease in things because it will spread from rose to rose, including the ones that you want to keep. So just be aware of that. We don't intentionally spread rose rosette disease, but you can be on the lookout for it. And that way you can know when it's going to be hitting the multiflora rose in your area and you can understand what's going on with it. Because multiflora rose, it is still subject to that disease. Remember, most of the roses that we have are descendants of multiflora rose. So multiflora rose is probably going to be just as susceptible. All right, so a little bit on our chemical control. So here's some good news, but I want you all to keep in mind that the more you use a particular chemical to try to control a plant, the more a plant will grow resistant to it. So that means that switching up how you're using your chemicals is often necessary to make sure that you don't run out of options and create a plant that's become resistant to everything. Now, before you do any kind of application, I mentioned this a moment ago, mowing or cutting the plants is a really, really good idea because that will make the plants much weaker, much more susceptible to the chemical that you're going to be applying to them. Remember, if the plant is busy dedicating energy towards regrowing, it's not going to be able to dedicate energy to being able to resist the effects of a disease or be able to recover from the stress more accurately that the chemicals that you place on them are going to begin to apply. I would stress that you want to make sure that you plan your applications properly with the proper timing in mind. And I have a calendar here I'm going to show you that SICM puts out. That's a very, very good calendar that instructs you on the proper timing for most chemical applications. As for the chemicals themselves, these plants do respond pretty well to glyphosate, triclopyr, and metsulfuron methyl. I probably typically see glyphosate being used the most often on multiflora rose. So as for the application timing, so foliar treatments can be done anytime during the growing season. But one thing I do want to stress with that is foliar treatment means that you are spraying a chemical. So you are risking then that chemical getting on other plants that you may not necessarily want to get that on. This is why it's important to make sure that you get some training to be able to do this, or maybe work with people who have that training before you just go willy-nilly spraying the stuff around, because you will impact the local area. To a greater or lesser degree is going to be up to how much you know. Cut stump, cut stem, and basal bark treatments can be done anytime. And I've seen cut stump or cut stem treatments are probably the most effective version of that you can do. Now, some treatments may have different timing based on the medium or the active ingredient they carry. For example, if you're wanting to use a chemical that's being carried in water or has a water base, it might help if you have a plant that's still like growing a little bit, or say you're doing it when the plant is going dormant. You want to make sure that as soon as you cut it, you're applying it. Whereas oil-based ones are a little bit easier to work with when the plants are more dormant because it soaks in much more easily. All right, so the calendar I was talking about. So this calendar you can find on the website of the State of Indiana Cooperative Invasive Management Organization. The website itself is sicm.info, and I'm going to put that in the chat right now, so that way you can see that. So this calendar will instruct you on a lot of different invasive plants and the proper timing to try to control them. But what we are going to be looking at more closely here is the one on top, and you'll see that I've got multiflora rose in that little red box on the right side there. However, I do want to cast your attention that this orange shaded area that I've created here not only includes multiflora rose, but also autumn olive, Asian bush honeysuckle, and winged burning bush for those of you who are interested. Now, you can see that May through September, foliar sprays are going to be effective, which kind of coincides when the plants are going to have the most active leaves and the leaves are growing. Whereas as you move through the year here, you're going to see that from May through September, foliar sprays work, but then past that point, cut stump, cut stem treatments are still going to remain effective all throughout the season. So it'll remain effective no matter when you put it on there. And then basal bark treatments tend to have the most efficacy after August has passed, as you're going into fall, up until the plants start greening back out again in early February, early March, depending on how warm it is and what you're working with. And then finally, one thing that I wanted to point out that I see a lot of people talking about is that prescribed burning. is actually a legitimate treatment for trying to remove multiflora rows. This can often work well with different forest environments because a lot of our woodlands are fire ecologies. That is how they begin to replace their own inventory. Fire goes through, it activates the germination of seeds of a variety of trees that are in the ground there. However, before you decide to get the flamethrower out of the garage, one thing I want to stress is that prescribed burns do require licensing and certification to be able to do, and you definitely should be doing it as a team. I have been to prescribed burns before. They are a lot of work, and it takes an intensive amount of planning to make sure that it doesn't get outside of your control. However, it can be very effective when applied properly. I just want to make sure to stress that prescribed burning must be done within the law. Here in Indiana, you must be within state law to do that. The other thing that I would also stress too is when we talk about all the chemical treatments that we use on multiflora rows, please make sure you are following the label that is on those chemicals. The label is the law. Not only that, those labels are intended so that way you have the least amount of impact on non-target species and you cause the least amount of damage to the environment. All right, that is what I've got for this evening, folks. This was a quick one. I will be putting this up on YouTube, and I invite those of you who are watching on YouTube right now to please add your comments below. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. And I'm just going to say good night to YouTube, and I will see you at the next